The fluorescent lights buzzed above Mercy General's trauma bay like angry wasps trapped in plastic. Rachel Torres stood at the medication cart, hands moving with geometric precision, each vial aligned perpendicular to the next, each syringe tip facing left. Savannah heat pressed against the loading dock door behind her, a wall of humid air that smelled like diesel exhaust and the Atlantic 2 miles south. Inside, everything smelled like antiseptic and floor wax. Like absence. She had been there 3 days. Nobody expected her to last the month. The temp agency had called her on a Tuesday morning at 5:22 a.m. "We have a crisis placement," the recruiter had said, voice bright with the kind of forced cheer that came from commission-based work. "Trauma nursing, immediate start, Mercy General in Savannah. Willing to relocate?" Rachel had said yes before the recruiter finished the question. Mercy General meant anonymity. A city large enough to disappear into, small enough that nobody asked questions. A hospital busy enough that quiet competence went unnoticed. That was the plan. She finished arranging the cart and moved to the supply shelves, pulling stock, sterile gauze pads in their paper packages, alcohol prep pads in their yellow sealed envelopes, 18-gauge for catheters lined in rows like ammunition. Her left hand trembled slightly as she reached for the top shelf, muscle memory from 3 tours of Kandahar making her flinch every time the ambulance bay doors slammed outside. The tremor was small enough that most people missed it. She controlled it with one measured breath, pressing her palm flat against the cool metal of the shelf until her fingers steadied. Pain was information. Tremor was data. Fear was just a physiological response. She had trained herself to observe these things like they belonged to someone else. The trauma bay filled with color and movement around her. A medical resident rushed past carrying a chart, nearly clipping her shoulder. A respiratory therapist wheeled a ventilator into the corner. 2 techs were restocking the crash cart, pulling open drawers with violent efficiency. None of them knew her name. None of them had asked. She was the temp nurse. The one who wouldn't talk during breaks. The one who showed up 40 minutes early and left 40 minutes late. The one who didn't drink coffee at the nursing station or gossip about the attending physicians or complain about shift assignments. Rachel had spent 12 years as a senior chief petty officer running combat medical operations in forward operating bases across Kandahar. She had taught herself to be invisible in hospitals the same way she had taught herself to be invisible in hostile territory. It was working. She turned to label a new full line and noticed a pair of expensive leather shoes entering the trauma bay. Italian. Probably $1,200. The shoes were followed by pressed khaki slacks with a knife crease, then a starched white coat that had never seen actual blood splatter, and finally Dr. Sterling. She knew his name before anyone told her. His voice announced him before his presence did, deep and resonant and carrying the particular timbre of someone who had never been questioned by anyone with institutional power. He had been the trauma director at Mercy General for 20 years. He had published papers in journals that Rachel had read during her night shifts at Walter Reed, back when she still thought she might go back to being a surgeon. He had built something here. An empire. A fiefdom. A place where the pecking order was established and defended with the precision of military hierarchy, except that in Dr. Sterling's world, rank was awarded by him alone. Torres. He said her name like he was addressing a faulty piece of equipment. "How many 4s have you placed this shift?" 4. Rachel didn't look up from the label she was writing. Her handwriting was precise. Military corners. Everything aligned. "And how many times have you called the resident before attempting access?" "None." She finished the label with a final stroke and placed it on the 4 bag. Now she turned to face him. This was the moment when she was supposed to defend herself, or apologize, or explain the reasoning behind her clinical decisions. This was the moment when most nurses would have said something about her competency or her years of experience. Rachel had learned a long time ago that silence was a weapon. Silence made people uncomfortable. Silence made them keep talking. "I see." Dr. Sterling raised his coffee cup to his lips, watching her over the rim. His eyes were grey and cold and assessing, moving across her face like he was reading a diagnostic image. Looking for cracks. Looking for weakness. Looking for evidence of the person she pretended to be. You understand that this is my trauma bay. These are my protocols. The chain of command exists for a reason. Yes, doctor. Good. He lowered the coffee cup. His smile was the kind that didn't reach his eyes. Because I have a feeling we should establish some expectations right now. Before you get too comfortable here. He turned to face the assembled staff, the resident, the respiratory therapist, the two techs who had paused in their restocking. Everyone looked up. I'm going to make a prediction. Mercy General has a well-established culture. We promote growth, we promote excellence, and we promote people who understand that excellence requires respect for the hierarchy. This is Rachel Torres. She's temp staff. She'll be with us for exactly 1 week before she realizes this job is above her level. The room was perfectly quiet. Someone's monitor beeped 3 rooms away. The sound was distant and clinical and final. I'd be happy to make it interesting, Dr. Sterling continued. Anyone want to place a wager? $500 says she quits by Friday. The resident laughed. It was the kind of laugh that happened because the boss had made a joke and pretending to find it funny was cheaper than the consequences of silence. The two techs exchanged glances. The respiratory therapist suddenly needed to check something on the ventilator. Rachel aligned another vial against the others on the cart. The movement was smooth and unhurried. Inside her chest, her heart rate was climbing. She could feel the old responses, adrenaline rising, pupils dilating, the particular weight that settled in her shoulders when she was being evaluated by someone with institutional authority. She had learned to observe these responses without being controlled by them. The tremor in her left hand returned for exactly 4 seconds. She pressed her palm against the medication cart until it stopped. That's very kind of you, doctor, she said quietly. But I'll be here past Friday. Dr. Sterling drank his coffee. He was still smiling. The rest of the shift passed without incident. Rachel moved through her assigned tasks with the kind of focus that excluded everything else. She started 2-4s. She drew blood from a patient who was terrified of needles and managed to do it so smoothly that the patient didn't even wince. She caught a medication error on a chart. The resident had ordered 1 gram of something when the patient's renal function indicated 0.5 was appropriate, and she corrected it quietly by leaving a note on the chart without telling anyone she had done it. The important work was invisible work. That was something they taught you in special forces, in combat medicine, in the field hospitals where every decision carried consequences and ego was a luxury you couldn't afford. You helped people. You didn't advertise it. You didn't need recognition for it. The work itself was the point. She was scheduled for lunch at 1:15 p.m. The cafeteria was crowded with hospital staff, nurses from the med-surg units, doctors from other departments, administrative personnel who didn't look capable of handling actual suffering. She grabbed a tray and moved through the line, selecting a salad and a cup of tomato soup and a roll. The bread smelled like actual yeast. It was a small thing, but it registered. Small things mattered in places like this. Small comforts. Small courtesies. Small moments where the world wasn't constantly trying to break you. She was carrying the tray toward an empty table in the corner when Dr. Sterling appeared beside her. He was carrying a plate of something expensive-looking, seared fish and microgreens and a sauce that cost money. He moved with the confidence of someone who had never once worried about taking up space. So. He was smiling. The same smile from the trauma bay. You're one of those quiet ones. Noble. Silent suffering. He adjusted his grip on his plate. You know what quiet ones never do. They never stay. Rachel didn't respond. She kept walking toward her table. They can't handle the pressure, he continued, matching her pace. They show up, they work hard, they try to prove something. But eventually they realize that hard work doesn't matter if nobody respects you. That you're always going to be at the bottom of the hierarchy. That there's no way up from there. He stepped in front of her. It was a calculated move. He was using his body to block her path, testing her reaction. Asserting dominance the way people did when they sensed a challenge and needed to respond to it. Rachel stopped. She was standing about 3 feet from her table. The soup was still steaming. She could smell the tomato base, the salt, the butter in the roll. Dr. Sterling knocked the tray out of her hands. It happened the way these things always happen in moments of deliberate cruelty. His elbow moved upward with casual violence, not like he was trying to hurt her but like she was so insignificant that her tray was just in his way. The soup splattered across her white scrubs first, a spray of red that looked like something worse than soup, that looked like blood to anyone watching. The bowl shattered against the tile floor. The roll fell and bounced. The salad container skittered across the linoleum and hit a table leg. 30 people were watching. The cafeteria had gone very quiet. Someone's utensil clattered against a plate. Somewhere, a microwave beeped its timer. Rachel stood there for exactly 3 seconds. Her left hand was trembling. Her scrubs were soaked. The smell of tomato soup mixed with her own shampoo and the antiseptic she'd washed with that morning. She knelt down and started cleaning it up. Hands moving on muscle memory. In Kandahar, you learn to clean up worse than this. You learn to do it while people watched. You learn not to cry, not to shake, not to let your face show anything except professional attention to the task at hand. Dr. Sterling was laughing. A sharp, satisfied sound. He had achieved what he wanted. He had established his dominance. He had proven to everyone in the room that the temp nurse was exactly what he had predicted, someone without power, someone without status, someone who could be pushed around. He tossed a patient chart onto the floor beside her. It was a deliberate addition to the humiliation. It was the moment when he decided to push further. "Pick that up, sweetheart," he said. "Temp work is still work." The room was so quiet you could hear the fluorescent lights humming overhead. Rachel finished wiping the soup off the tile. She gathered the pieces of the broken bowl, the food, everything. When the floor was clean, she stood. Her scrubs were ruined. Her hair had a streak of soup in it. She had soup in her shoes. She picked up the patient chart he had thrown at her feet. And then she looked at him. One tear escaped. Just one. It rolled down her cheek while her eyes remained perfectly steady. While her jaw remained perfectly clenched. While her expression remained perfectly composed. She didn't wipe it away immediately. She let him see it. She wanted him to see that she was human, that she could be hurt, that he had accomplished something. Then she wiped it away with the back of her hand without breaking eye contact. "I've cleaned up worse messes from better men, doctor," she said. Her voice was quiet. It was almost conversational. But it carried weight because it was delivered by someone who was not trembling, who was not begging, who was not offering excuses or apologies. It was delivered by someone who had held dying soldiers in her hands and still managed to save their lives. Someone who had made impossible decisions at 3 a.m. in a forward operating base in Kandahar. Someone who had spent 12 years as a senior chief petty officer in special forces and had decided, just 3 days ago, that she was going to disappear into a temp position at a trauma center in Savannah and keep her head down. Except her head wasn't down anymore. She carried the patient chart back to the nursing station, her ruined scrubs leaving small wet footprints on the tile behind her. The entire cafeteria watched her go. Dr. Sterling stood motionless, his expensive plate still in his hands, his smile finally gone. The room was silent now. Dr. Sterling stood motionless, his expensive plate still in his hands, his smile finally gone. Rachel had already turned away, moving toward the trauma bay with the same measured pace she'd used for the past 3 days at Mercy General, invisible, unremarkable, exactly what a temp was supposed to be. Behind her, she could hear him setting the plate down on a nearby table with deliberate care, like a man placing a chess piece. She didn't look back. She never did. That was the trick she'd learned. Stay invisible. Take the hits. Don't let them see you flinch. The combat boots were still wrapped in a Walmart bag at the bottom of her locker, stuffed between spare compression socks and a name badge she hadn't needed since Kandahar. 12 years ago. Another life. Another name, really, the one carved into the unit patch she'd sewn into the jacket lining of her old field coat, the one folded in a storage unit 40 miles away. Senior Chief Petty Officer Rachel Torres, combat medic, rated for field amputations and emergency thoracotomies, trained to work under 120 decibels of rotor wash and indirect fire. Now she restocked trauma supplies and took verbal abuse from a surgeon with a 7-figure salary and the emotional intelligence of a linebacker. The Friday night trauma bay was quieter than usual. Just past 11, the weekend injuries hadn't started rolling in yet. Rachel moved between the supply carts methodically, saline drips, sterile gloves, the blue emergency intubation kits that all the nurses knew how to set up but couldn't legally deploy. She arranged them with the same precision she'd used to organize field surgical stations, though she forced herself to move slower, less efficiently. Draw attention and you invited questions. Impress people and you became a problem for someone like Dr. Sterling, someone whose entire kingdom depended on everyone knowing exactly where they stood in the hierarchy. She stood below ground level. She was fine with that. Fine with the coffee talk, the snide remarks, the way he deliberately used patient charts to mark territory like an animal marking trees. The cafeteria incident had burned itself into her mind, though she'd let it show only as a single tear before she locked it away. 12 years of combat medicine. She'd held a lance corporal's intestines together with her hands while calling in medevac coordinates. She'd amputated a staff sergeant's arm below the elbow with a surgical saw and a voice calm as a meditation recording. And on Friday afternoon, she'd knelt on a cafeteria floor in front of 20 nurses while soup dripped from her scrubs and Dr. Sterling stood over her like a conqueror. What surprised her wasn't the humiliation, she'd survived worse. It was how automatic the response had been. The tear. The trembling hand as she picked up the tray. Like her body remembered what civilian weakness felt like. The chart incident 30 minutes later had brought something else to the surface. Not anger. Anger was something she'd cut out of herself in 2011, back in Helmand Province, when anger made you slow and slow got people killed. What she'd felt was clarity. Cold, measured clarity. The kind that made her voice drop 2 octaves when she told Dr. Sterling exactly how little his dominance meant to her. I've cleaned up worse messes from better men, Doctor. She'd watched his smile falter. Just for half a second. But she'd seen it. Everyone had. Now they were whispering. She'd heard them in the break room after shift, sympathy mixed with fear, the particular cocktail of emotions people felt when they saw someone stand up to a predator and didn't immediately get eaten. They were wondering if she'd last. Dr. Sterling was wondering if she'd quit. She was wondering if her hands would ever stop trembling at the wrong moments, and whether the rest of the night would pass without incident. The answer came at 11:53 p.m. The ambulance bay doors exploded open. Not the smooth hydraulic rush of a normal arrival, a violent, chaotic crash like something had hit the doors from the outside with tremendous force. Rachel's head snapped up. The rest of the trauma staffs did too, though they were trained to respond to overhead announcements, to code blue paging, to the orchestrated protocols of structured emergency. This sounded like nothing in any protocol. Then the man came through. 7 feet tall. Blood-soaked from scalp to sternum. Eyes wide as saucers and tracking nothing, pupils blown so wide they looked like black holes in the center of his face. He was screaming, not words, just a raw, primal sound that came from somewhere beneath reason, beneath language, the sound of an animal with something fundamentally wrong happening inside its body. In his right hand, he gripped a metal stand, the kind used for hanging saline drips, and he was swinging it like a baseball bat. The trauma bay froze for exactly 1 heartbeat. Then everyone moved at once, but not toward him. Away. A resident back behind a supply cart. 2 nurses scrambled toward the medication dispensary. The security guard, a man named Terrence who worked weekends and was built like a defensive lineman, reached for his radio. Code Gray. Code Grey. Ambulance bay, 7-foot male, armed with hospital equipment. The four-stand came up again, and this time there was something behind the motion, not aim, exactly, but momentum. The man rotated his hips and swung, his arm describing a perfect arc toward a computer monitor mounted on the wall. The stand connected with a sound like a gunshot and the monitor exploded into a cascade of sparks and plastic fragments. Someone screamed. Terence was already moving toward him, hand raised, radio still in his other hand. 2 more security personnel appeared through the interior doors, both carrying batons, both looking like they were walking toward a building fire and hoping it would just stay contained in one room. Dr. Sterling had been standing at the far end of the trauma bay, reviewing something on a tablet. Rachel had seen him from the corner of her eye, the usual territorial presence, the way he occupied space like he owned the oxygen. Now she watched him move with surprising speed toward the interior corridor. He didn't call for help. Didn't try to de-escalate or slow down. He simply reversed course and headed for his office, his walk becoming a fast walk, becoming almost a jog. She saw him pull his keys out. Saw the office door open. Saw it close and heard, even from the trauma bay, the distinct sound of a deadbolt sliding into place. The man with the four-stand turned toward the sound. His chest was moving unevenly. Rachel noticed this with the part of her brain that had been trained to notice asymmetrical breathing, that had been wired in Kandahar to read vital signs from across a dusty operating tent. His left side was rising and falling with proper mechanics. His right side barely moved at all. His lips had a faint blue tint. Not from cold. From oxygen deprivation. And those pupils, those blown-wide pupils weren't drugs or psychosis or pure adrenaline. That was hypoxia talking. That was a brain screaming for oxygen while the body's lungs tried to work around something catastrophically wrong inside the chest cavity. Tension pneumothorax. A puncture wound, probably, something that had let air into the space between the lung and the chest wall. The air was accumulating, compressing the lung, making it impossible for him to breathe properly. His body was in full sympathetic response, fighting, fleeing, swinging a metal stand at anything and nothing because his neural system was fundamentally broken. He had maybe 90 seconds before the other lung got involved. Maybe 120 if she was lucky. After that, his heart would stop compensating and the entire mechanism would seize. Rachel's left hand began to tremble. She watched it happen as if it belonged to someone else. Her fingers flickering against her scrubs, a tremor that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with muscle memory, recognizing that she was about to do something that nobody here would understand, that her hands were remembering a job she'd promised herself 12 years ago she was finished with. She forced her fingers into a fist, pressed the fist against her leg. The trembling stopped. Batons ready. Terence was calling to the other security officers. Keep your distance, let him burn energy. The man swung again, this time toward a medication cart. The four-stand connected and the cart toppled, sending bottles cascading across the floor with the sound of 1,000 tiny avalanches. One of the nurses, a young RN named Marcus, let out a yelp and pressed himself against the wall. Rachel could see his chest heaving, see the whites of his eyes, see the very reasonable fear of someone who'd just watched 300 pounds of enraged humanity wreck a quarter of the room's equipment. Rachel, get back! Another nurse, Sheila, who'd been kind to her despite Dr. Sterling's obvious disapproval, was calling from behind a supply cabinet. Rachel, Eno! Rachel was already moving. Not away. Toward. She walked directly into the space between the security guards and the 7-foot man, her hands raised with her palms forward, fingers spread wide in the universal gesture of non-threat. She was 5'6" and maybe 130 pounds, and she was walking toward someone who'd just swung a metal stand hard enough to destroy electronic equipment. The man's eyes locked on her. The four-stand began to rise. Her voice came out different. Not the deferential, quiet voice she'd been cultivating for 3 days. Not the carefully neutral tone of a temp nurse trying not to offend. Her voice dropped an octave and went crystalline, with an undertone that carried the weight of someone who'd given orders while people shot at her. The voice of a senior chief petty officer who'd held a radio handset in one palm and a bleeding soldier in the other. "Hey! Look at me! I know it hurts." The man's swing slowed. His breathing stayed ragged, but something shifted in his expression, confusion breaking through the fog of hypoxia, the animal panic giving way to the recognition of another human voice speaking sense. The first stand hung suspended in midair, the metal creaking slightly under the tension of his grip. "I know you can't breathe. I know your chest is on fire." Rachel took one more step forward, her hand still visible. "But I can help you. I know how. You just have to let me." His lips were blue now. The asymmetrical breathing was accelerating. She could see his heart rate climbing in the distension of his neck veins, maybe 120, 130, a cardiovascular system working triple time to compensate for lungs that weren't functioning properly. Behind Rachel, she could feel the security guards tense, ready to move in if she got him to lower the force stand, ready to jump if he swung again. "I need you on a stretcher. Right now. Can you do that?" The man's arm wavered. The force stand lowered 6 inches. His eyes, still wild, still oversized, and reflecting the fluorescent trauma bay lights like something feral, focused on her face. He was looking at someone. A person. An anchor. "My name is Rachel. What's yours?" "See can't." His voice was a rasp, barely coherent, the sound of someone whose throat and lungs hadn't had a full exchange of oxygen in several minutes. "Can't breathe, can't." "I know. That's why we're going to fix it. Right now." She stepped to the side and gestured toward the nearest stretcher, the one they kept ready rolled in the corner of the trauma bay. "Lie down. Just lie down and let me work." He moved like someone operating through water, his massive frame shifting with the slowness of someone whose brain wasn't getting enough oxygen to execute complex motor control efficiently. He dropped the force stand. It clattered against the tile floor with a sound that made Sheila flinch from behind her supply cabinet. The man turned and took 3 staggering steps toward the stretcher, then lowered himself onto it with Rachel's hand steadying his shoulders, her voice continuing in that low, measured cadence. "Good. Perfect. You're doing great. Just keep breathing for me. You're going to get oxygen in about 30 seconds. She didn't wait for a response. She was already moving, her hands reaching for the trauma supply she'd spent the afternoon organizing with such careful precision. Her muscle memory took over in a way that felt almost like possession. Her body knew what to do even as her conscious mind was observing the action from a distance, watching these hands move the way they'd moved 1,000 times in a different country, under different circumstances, with different tools but the same fundamental anatomy underneath. Tension pneumothorax. Lungs collapsing. 90 seconds ticking down. She pulled a 14-gauge angiocatheter from the emergency airway kit, her fingers moving with the crystalline precision of someone who'd practiced this procedure while mortars fell and helicopters landed and everything around her was chaos translating into clarity through her hands. The man was lying on the stretcher now, his breathing accelerating into something that looked almost like gasping, his lips moving soundlessly. Rachel located the second intercostal space, midclavicular line, the textbook location for emergency needle decompression. She swabbed the area with an alcohol wipe, the smell of antiseptic filling her nostrils with the sharpness of a blade, and felt the man's ribs rise beneath her fingertips. She positioned the catheter at 90 degrees to his chest wall and pushed. The needle penetrated the skin, the muscle, the pleural membrane. And then, the moment she'd been waiting for, the moment that would determine whether the next 60 seconds led to life or to a very different trajectory, the hiss of air escaping. The decompression came with an audible whoosh, like someone had let the air out of a tire, the breath of a pneumothorax collapsing in on itself as the pressure equalized. The man's eyes went wide, but in a different way now. His gasping slowed. His breathing synchronized. His lips, the blue finally beginning to pale from their dark cyanotic color, were drawing in oxygen again, the air moving through passages that had finally reopened. Rachel kept the catheter steady, her other hand already reaching for the O2 mask, for the monitor leads, for the 4-line that she was going to need for sedatives. Terence had materialized beside her, his baton dropped on the counter, his training taking over from his fear. Other nurses were gathering, moving in with the orchestrated speed of an actual trauma team, no longer scattered in defensive positions but unified in the singular purpose of keeping a man alive. She didn't have time to notice Dr. Sterling's office door still closed. Didn't have time to think about what she'd just done in front of a dozen witnesses, or what it meant, or what the consequences might be for a temp nurse who'd just performed a combat field medical procedure without authorization, without a doctor's order, without anything except the knowledge that a man's lung was collapsing and that she had the skills to stop it. She just moved her hands where they needed to go and kept him breathing. By Monday morning, the wheels were already turning. Dr. Sterling had spent the weekend on his phone. Not angry calls, worse. Strategic ones. The kind of calls a man makes when he's decided to dismantle someone systematically, methodically, the way a surgeon removes a tumor. He'd started with Rachel's temp agency Saturday night, pulling every connection he had in the staffing world. 3 phone calls. Within an hour, he'd planted seeds of doubt about her credentials, her experience, her stability. Just asking questions, he'd told the agency supervisor. Want to make sure we're protecting our hospital from liability. By Sunday morning, he'd escalated. An outside investigator, someone from a credentials firm he'd worked with before, was already opening a file on Rachel Torres. Sterling had framed it carefully: unusual military background, suspicious combat medical knowledge, unauthorized procedures in a civilian trauma bay. No accusations. Just inquiry. Just due diligence. The investigator would find nothing, but Sterling didn't need to prove anything. He needed to create enough smoke that administration would assume fire. He needed questions that couldn't be answered quickly. He needed Rachel's past weaponized against her. Sunday night, he filed formal complaints. 3 separate documents, each one carefully worded to avoid libel while maximizing damage. Unauthorized invasive procedures performed without attending supervision or written protocol approval. Suspicious military-style interventions that warrant investigation into possible credential falsification. Potential risk to patient safety due to unverified combat medical training. Each complaint was addressed to the hospital board, copied to HR, flagged as urgent. Rachel didn't know any of this. She'd gone home Friday night after the save, pulled off her scrubs, showered until the water ran cold, and sat in the dark of her apartment for 3 hours without moving. She'd expected relief. Instead, she felt nothing. Just the hollow quiet that came after adrenaline burned away. Monday morning arrived with the kind of Savannah humidity that made the air feel solid. Rachel had come in early for her shift, intending to work quietly, to let the crisis fade into routine. The ER was predictable in the early hours: stable patients, routine admissions, the rhythm of a hospital before the chaos. She'd changed into fresh scrubs, pulled her hair back with the same precision she'd used for 12 years, and was restocking the crash cart when the charge nurse approached. "Rachel, HR needs to see you. Now." 3 words. They landed like a fist. She didn't ask questions. She already knew. The knowing was in her bones, the same knowing that had kept her alive in Kandahar when something felt wrong about an intersection, a rooftop, a civilian's eyes. Danger had its own frequency, and her nervous system was tuned to recognize it. The HR office was on the 3rd floor. The elevator took 45 seconds. Rachel counted every one. The meeting lasted 17 minutes. The HR director sat behind a desk with Dr. Sterling standing at his shoulder, a deliberate positioning, a statement. The complaints were formal. The investigation was already underway. The unauthorized procedure was a serious breach of protocol. The military background was concerning and required verification. They were placing her on immediate suspension pending the investigation's completion. Her badge would be deactivated. She was to collect her personal effects and leave the hospital. "This isn't a termination yet," the HR director said, the words meant to sound neutral and sounding instead like an execution with a stay of sentence. "But we need to understand what happened in that trauma bay, and we need to understand your background." Rachel stood very still. "I saved that man's life." "By performing a procedure," Sterling said, his voice smooth as oil, "that you weren't authorized to perform. In a hospital. With protocols." Rachel looked at him. Really looked at him. Watched him standing there in his white coat with his arms crossed, secure in the knowledge that his network was thicker than hers, his connections more powerful, his position more stable. She'd seen men like him before, privileged, insulated, convinced that the world worked the way they'd built it. She'd also seen men like him shattered. But not today. Today she just left. The walk to her locker was longer than it should have been. The ER seemed different now, not hostile exactly, but neutral in a way that felt worse. People who'd worked beside her Friday night suddenly found work to do on the other side of the department. One nurse made brief eye contact and looked away. Nobody said anything. Nobody stopped her. Her locker was narrow and her shift, it turned out, had been measured in days. The cracked mug, a gift from a unit medic in 2009, the handle repaired with superglue 3 times, went into a cardboard box. The dying plant, a small succulent she'd forgotten to water while working 70-hour weeks, went in beside it. A photograph, worn at the edges, the kind printed on actual photo paper instead of digital, her unit in Kandahar, 2011. 14 faces. 7 of them were in Arlington now. She stared at the photo for longer than was tactically sound. Emotion was data. Data could be processed. She folded it carefully and placed it in the box. The boots were on the shelf above, leather-worn soft from 200 combat missions, the insoles mold to her feet, the laces frayed at the edges. Combat boots from Fort Liberty. They'd walked through Sanjin Valley. They'd stood in a hospital trauma bay on Friday night at 11:33 p.m. She reached for them, then stopped. Left them there. They weren't ready to leave yet. But that wasn't the worst part. The walkout happened at 2:14 p.m. Badge deactivated, her access cards disabled mid-stride so the turnstiles at the employee exit wouldn't open. A security guard had to manually disable the gate for her? The slight smile on his face suggested he understood what was happening. Former military himself, probably. He'd seen this before, the machinery of institutions turning against its own. He didn't say anything either, just pressed the gate release and held it open. Outside, the Savannah heat hit like a physical force. 93 degrees and climbing. The cardboard box got heavier the longer she stood there. Rachel walked to the bus stop on Victory Drive, rain-soaked concrete from an early afternoon downpour, the kind of rain that came to Georgia and stayed a while. She sat on the bench with the box on her lap and waited. She waited for her phone to ring. For someone to call and say they'd reviewed the footage, they understood, they were hiring her back. It didn't ring. She waited for an email. For any acknowledgement that she'd saved a life, that the protocol she'd violated was the only thing standing between a man and death. Nothing came. The rain intensified. Not dramatic rain, just steady, relentless Georgia rain that smelled like wet asphalt and river water and the kind of humidity that pressed against the chest. A woman hurried past the bus stop, holding a briefcase over her head. A delivery truck splashed through a pothole and sent spray across the sidewalk. The world moved around Rachel like she was already a ghost. She should have felt something. Anger. Fear. Desperation. Instead there was just the familiar cold that had kept her breathing through 12 years of things that would break normal people. The cold that had let her perform field amputations at 19 years old. The cold that had let her walk toward a 7-foot man with an forestand raised. The cold that had let her survive. But 12 years had worn that cold thin. 12 years of holding it together, and then 12 days of pretending to be someone she wasn't, and now 12 minutes of sitting in the rain while her own hospital discarded her like she'd never been there. She thought about the boots still in the locker. Thought about going back for them. Thought about never going back to anything ever again. The bus was late by 11 minutes, Rachel counted, and when it arrived, she stood, one hand on the cardboard box, the other gripping the bench. The effort of movement felt immense, like standing in full gear after a 40-mile forced march. A driver opened the doors. Rachel stepped inside. Paid cash for a ticket. Found a seat in the back where she could see the aisles. Old training. Old habits. By Monday evening she'd already changed hotels twice. By Tuesday morning she'd opened a new checking account under a name that wasn't hers but had paperwork that made it look like it was. By Tuesday afternoon she was packing a new cardboard box with thrift store clothes and a toothbrush. By Tuesday evening, she stood at a different bus stop, this one 7 miles from Mercy General, beneath an overhang that was doing nothing to stop the rain, holding the new box of nothing in her hands and feeling the weight of every choice that had brought her to this place. Every lie. Every time she'd said just a nurse when someone asked what she did. Every time she'd bitten back the truth, swallowed the history, pretended to be smaller than she was. The rain hammered against the overhang. A greyhound pulled up across the street. Destination marquee scrolling through cities: Richmond, Charlotte, Nashville, Memphis. She could get on that bus. She could run again. She'd gotten very good at running. Or she could go back to that locker and retrieve the boots. Rachel stood in the rain-soaked darkness of a Tuesday evening in Savannah, Georgia, and made a decision that would have seemed impossible 12 hours earlier. She sat down on the bench. Pulled out her phone. Dialed a number she'd sworn never to call. "This is Rachel Torres," she said, when it connected. "Senior Chief Petty Officer Rachel Torres. And I need to report a crime." The voice on the other end went very still. "Who am I speaking to?" Rachel asked. "This is Joint Base Lewis McCord. Recording the call now. Please state your..." "I was terminated this morning from Mercy General Hospital in Savannah, Georgia, for saving a man's life. The trauma surgeon who had me fired has filed false complaints with hospital administration. I have witnesses. I have video. And I have a hospital director who's about to realize that making an enemy out of the wrong person was a tactical error." Rain continued falling. The greyhound pulled away without her. By Wednesday morning, 3 phone calls had been made. By Thursday, a rear admiral from Naval Special Warfare Command had arrived in Savannah with questions and a camera crew. By Friday, Dr. Sterling's office looked very different than it had the week before, emptier, sharper, colder, with the air of a place that had just had its foundation removed. But that wasn't this moment. This moment was just a nurse, a cardboard box, and the knowledge that sometimes the bravest thing a person could do was stop running and fight. She didn't flinch. She didn't break. She just sat in the rain and waited for dawn. 3 days. That's how long the 7-foot man slept in the ICU while his lungs finally remembered how to breathe on their own. The monitor above his bed beeped its steady rhythm, a sound Rachel Torres would never hear again if she stayed on that bus. But she didn't stay on the bus. She'd made a call Tuesday night from a gas station payphone, the kind nobody uses anymore, and spoken 4 words to a number she'd memorized 12 years ago: "I need to come home." By Wednesday morning, the call had already traveled through 3 military chains of command and arrived back at Mercy General in the form of a quiet suggestion from hospital administration. 1 supervised visit. Collect your forgotten personal items. Professional courtesy before legal proceedings begin. She didn't expect to find him conscious. Rachel pushed through the ICU double doors at 9:17 a.m., her cardboard box of former life still in her car, the cracked mug, the dying plant, the photograph of 8 faces. She'd gone back to the bus stop after that phone call, retrieved the box, sat in her apartment with the lights off at 3 a.m., and waited. The combat boots she'd finally retrieved from her hospital locker were tucked under her arm now, worn leather creaking softly as she moved. She'd carried them for 3 months without opening the box, without acknowledging what they meant. 12 years compressed into 2 pounds of soul and stitching. The patient's room was at the end of the corridor. Room for 17. The numbers came back to her automatically, old training, the kind that never really left. Survey the space. Note exits. Count occupants. Assess threat level. It was a habit from another lifetime, muscle memory of a woman who didn't exist anymore according to Mercy General's termination letter. She reached for the door handle when she heard voices inside. Two of them. One was the patient's. She recognized the hoarse quality of post-intubation vocal cords, the ragged breathing of lungs still remembering how to function. The other was younger. Military. She could hear it in the cadence before she opened the door, in the precise way the words landed. Discipline encoded in speech patterns. A Marine officer sat in the visitor's chair, dress uniform crisp enough to cut yourself on, captain's bars catching the fluorescent light. He couldn't have been more than 35, maybe 40, with the kind of posture that came from 8 years of standing at attention. He was holding his father's hand, the tough exterior of a Marine officer softened into something almost fragile. The father, the 7-foot attacker, the reason Rachel no longer had a job, was awake. His eyes were clearer than they'd been on that Friday night when hypoxia had turned him into something feral. The monitor showed O2 sat at 94%. Normal. Stable. Alive. Because of her. Just needed to grab something, Rachel said quietly, keeping her voice level, her expression neutral. The composure had calcified into something permanent now, a second skeleton underneath her skin. She'd had 48 hours to practice it. Won't take a minute. The patient's head turned toward her voice with the mechanical slowness of someone still learning how to move again. His eyes tracked across her face, then down, searching, focusing, locking onto the worn leather of the combat boots under her arm. The stitching was coming loose at the heel. The sole was worn thin at the ball of the foot from 1,000 miles of patrol routes through Kandahar's Jolan district. The right boot had a long scuff across the side where a ricochet had come close enough to kiss the leather. The man's hand tightened on his son's. Reaper. The word came out barely a whisper, hoarse and broken, but absolutely certain. As if he'd been waiting 3 days for someone to confirm his own survival by walking through that door. The Marine officer went rigid. His entire body locked in place, shoulders back, head turning toward Rachel with the precision of a targeting system acquiring its lock. When he stood all at once, military movement, chair pushed back in one smooth motion. His eyes, dark brown, intelligent, trained, tracked from Rachel's face to the boots and back again. His jaw worked once, twice, like he was testing whether his voice still functioned. Senior Chief. His voice cracked on the second word, and Rachel felt something in her chest shift like a tectonic plate realigning. 12 years compressed into 2 words. 12 years of running, hiding, pretending to be someone small enough to fit into the margins of other people's lives. She didn't answer. She couldn't. The protocol of the situation, the supervised visit, the hospital administrator waiting in the hallway outside, the careful machinery of her remaining employment being terminated, it all required her to stay silent, to collect whatever she'd supposedly left behind, to exit without speaking, without confirming, without returning from the dead. But the man in the bed had seen her face in a combat zone. Had felt her hands working on his chest in the dark while mortars landed 200 meters away. Had listened to her voice talking him down from a hypoxia-fueled nightmare in the trauma bay, and that voice had called him back to consciousness because it was the same voice that had saved him in Kandahar. And the Marine officer was looking at her like she'd just stepped out of a photograph he'd studied for years, trying to understand why his father had a military commendation for a woman named Senior Chief Petty Officer Rachel Torres in his safety deposit box. A nurse entered from the side corridor, stopped, read something in the sudden tension of the room, and quietly excused herself. But not before Rachel heard the intake of breath, the recognition, the question being born before it could be spoken. A second nurse appeared in the doorway, called by some invisible signal. Then a third. They materialized like prayers finally answered, standing behind her, reading the chart Rachel had just realized she could no longer see from her position, because everything in the room had shifted. The door to the ICU opened again. A man in navy dress whites entered without knocking, captain's rank on his shoulder, insignia on his chest that marked him as something above the hospital hierarchy. His eye swept the room once, registered the Marine officer, Rachel, the patient, the cluster of nurses with trembling hands now reading something, a document, a file, something that had been pulled from somewhere deep in the hospital's secure records. "Senior Chief Petty Officer Rachel Torres," he said. "Not a question. A confirmation." His voice carried the weight of command structure, of bureaucracies and decisions made at levels the hospital administrator had never accessed. Kandahar. 2019, November. Rachel didn't respond. The voice that came next belonged to the patient, still hoarse, still broken, but absolute in its certainty. "Ambush. FOB Shank perimeter. 12 of us in that convoy." His eyes were locked on hers. "Everyone thought we were dead. She pulled us out. Under fire. Hands steady like a surgeon's, moving like she'd done it 1,000 times before." "SEAL liaison contacted through proper channels," the captain said, still addressing the room but moving toward Rachel. "Your family requested your identity be verified based on operational history. This," he gestured at something the nurses were still reading, their hands shaking now, "confirms everything. Navy Cross. 3 bronze stars with Valor. 2 purple hearts." The Marine officer was crying now, silently, the kind of tears that come when someone you've been taught doesn't exist suddenly materializes in front of you. "Senior Chief Torres trained my unit. Every combat medic in NAVSPECWAR Group 2 passed through her instruction. My father has her commendation framed in his study. I've read the citation 100 times." He was looking at Rachel like she'd just walked out of a classified file and become flesh. "I'm Captain Torres. I'm his son." "And you're..." "My mother," the patient whispered from the bed. The room went so quiet you could hear the ventilator in the next bed, 3 rooms down, moving air in and out with mechanical precision. The fluorescent lights hummed their constant hymn. Someone's shoes squeaked on the linoleum in the hallway outside. Rachel stood very still, the combat boot still under her arm, still worn, still real, still carrying 12 years of things she'd tried to leave behind. A phone rang. Someone's cell phone, the sharp electronic chirp that belongs to no hospital in the world. The captain answered it, listened, said 3 words, "Confirmed. She's here." Then he hung up and looked at Rachel with something that might have been respect, or might have been the recognition of a legend stepping out of a photograph. "Admiral's en route," he said. 20 minutes. "Should we call security or—" "No," Rachel said. Her voice came out exactly the way it had in that trauma bay, steady, authoritative, the voice of someone who had spent 12 years making split-second decisions that kept people alive. "No security. No paperwork. No ceremony." She set the combat boots down on the edge of the patient's bed, placed her hand over his, and for the first time in 72 hours, she let herself breathe like someone who'd just made it back to friendly territory. The Admiral's uniform filled the doorway before his voice did. Rear Admiral James Halloway, 41 years commanding combat operations across 2 continents, walked into Dr. Sterling's office with the hospital board chairman on his left and a camera crew on his right, 2 cameramen, a sound tech, and a woman with a tablet and the expression of someone about to make history. The Admiral didn't knock. He didn't ask permission. He walked in like he owned the room, because in that moment, he absolutely did. Dr. Sterling looked up from his desk, confidence still painted across his face. He had no idea what was about to walk through those doors. Literally. He thought this was a routine meeting about protocol violations and staff management. The smile on his face lasted exactly 2 seconds after the cameras came into focus. The Admiral's voice carried into the hallway where half the hospital staff had somehow gathered. Word spread fast in a place like Mercy General, something was happening in the administrative wing. Something big. Nurses clustered near the water cooler. Orderlies pretended to restock supply carts. Everyone was listening. Senior Chief Petty Officer Rachel Torres, the Admiral began, his voice like a tank idling in a garage, low and inexorable, received the Navy Cross for extracting 12 wounded soldiers under direct enemy fire in Kandahar, 2019. He held up a folder. 12 soldiers. In one night. While she was bleeding from a fragmentation wound to her left shoulder. Dr. Sterling's face went pale. His hand moved toward his phone. The Admiral's eyes flicked to it, just a glance, and Sterling's hand froze. She personally performed for field amputations that night, the Admiral continued, stepping closer to the desk. The camera followed. For limbs saved for lives. Bilateral above knee, bilateral below knee. Performed with a combat knife and a 14-gauge angiocath needle because that's what was available in a firefight 2 kilometers from the closest support team. The Admiral's jaw was set like granite. She trained every combat medic in the 75th Ranger Regiment's Bravo Company. 37 soldiers. Every single one of them alive today. The board chairman spoke next, his voice steady and cold as ice water. Dr. Sterling, you filed formal complaints against this woman for performing a life-saving procedure she'd executed dozens of times in a combat theater. You initiated an investigation into her credentials. You contacted her temporary staffing agency and requested her termination. He paused. The silence stretched like a rubber band pulled too tight. You locked yourself in your office and watched her save a man's life while you hid. Dr. Sterling stood up. I followed proper hospital protocol. She violated. You violated nothing, the Admiral cut him off, his voice dropping so low the cameras had to lean in to catch it. The sound tech gestured frantically at the cameraman to adjust the microphone. You violated someone's right to help. And then you destroyed her career for being better than you at something you've never had to do. The Admiral stepped so close to the desk their shoes were almost touching. I've watched good men die because their medic wasn't good enough. I've held their hands while they bled out. Senior Chief Torres has held the hands of soldiers who made it home because she was the medic in that convoy. The board chairman's voice came again, formal and devastating. Effective immediately, Dr. Sterling, you are terminated for cause. Your actions constitute a breach of fiduciary duty to this hospital, to this patient, and to your staff. Your medical license will be referred to the South Carolina Medical Board for a full investigation. Security will escort you from the building. 2 security guards appeared in the doorway. They weren't unkind about it. They didn't need to be. The cameras captured everything, Sterling's face crumpling, his expensive suit suddenly looking like a costume that didn't fit, the way his hands shook as he grabbed his briefcase. The Admiral didn't look at him again. He was already turning toward the hallway, toward the gathered staff, toward history. The walk to the elevators took 90 seconds. It felt like 90 minutes. Every eye in the hospital lobby was on Dr. Sterling. Every eye watched him pass, the nurses he'd humiliated, the residents he'd terrorized, the cleaning staff he'd ignored for 15 years. A woman named Margaret, who'd worked housekeeping for 18 years, watched with her hands folded in front of her. Dr. Sterling had never even learned her name. He'd called her the cleaning lady last Tuesday when she wasn't moving fast enough with the mop. Now she watched him pass without expression, and that lack of expression was somehow worse than contempt. The elevator doors slid open. Dr. Sterling stepped inside. The doors closed. And the room erupted in whispers that sounded like applause. What happened next didn't just silence the rumors around Mercy General. It echoed outward. Medical boards across 3 states received copies of Sterling's file. Insurance companies started auditing his malpractice claims. Within 3 weeks, no hospital in Georgia would consider hiring him. His medical license was suspended pending investigation by September. By November, the state board had completed their review and placed him on permanent suspension, citing a pattern of abuse of position and systematic harassment of staff. 1 month later, Dr. Sterling sat at a folding table outside a strip mall in downtown Savannah, selling life insurance policies to people passing by. His expensive watch was gone, replaced with a digital drugstore model that cost $12. His tailored suits had been traded for Target khakis and a polo shirt with the company logo embroidered on the chest. 3 people he'd worked with passed by without stopping. He didn't make a single sale that day. 6 months later, Rachel Torres laced up the pair of worn combat boots in her new office at Mercy General. The boots were no longer hidden in a locker, no longer tucked away like something shameful. They sat on a shelf behind her desk, displayed openly next to a folded American flag that had been presented to her by the Admiral himself, the flag that had draped the casket of her unit's radio operator, the one she'd held while he bled out in her arms 12 years ago. Her nameplate was mounted directly outside the office door in letters that caught the light: Rachel Torres, Director of Trauma Services. The room around her had changed. The walls were covered with protocols she'd written, new triage procedures based on battlefield medicine, rapid response authorization for senior nursing staff, mandatory de-escalation training for every trauma team member. She'd implemented something she called the Combat Ready Protocol, a system that prioritized speed, communication, and the kind of lateral thinking that kept people alive when resources were scarce. Captain Torres, the Admiral's son, the young Marine officer who'd been at his father's bedside, walked into her office at 0600 on a Wednesday morning. He was out of uniform now, wearing civilian clothes, but he moved like a man who'd spent his life learning to carry weight. He wasn't alone. Walking beside him was the man Rachel had saved, her patient from that Friday night, now healed enough to walk without support, now here to say what he'd been waiting 6 months to say. "Reaper," he said, using her call sign like it was the most natural thing in the world. His hand gripped hers. His fingers were steady. "You saved my life twice. Once in that trauma bay with a needle and a prayer. Once in Kandahar when you didn't let me bleed out in the sand." Rachel's left hand trembled, just slightly, just for a moment, the way it always did when someone spoke about Kandahar. She took one measured breath. The trembling stopped. She looked at him directly, and when she spoke, her voice was steady as a surgeon's hand. "That's what we do. We walk toward the danger, not away from it. That's the only direction I've ever known." She led morning rounds at 0700, moving through the ICU with a kind of quiet authority that didn't need a title to announce itself. The staff watched her work, watched the way she examined a patient, the way she listened to residents without interrupting, the way she corrected a young nursing student's technique by showing her the right way instead of just telling her she was wrong. A new temporary nurse was struggling with a post-operative vitals chart. Rachel caught her making an error in her calculations and pulled her aside, not in front of the patient, not in front of the attending physician, but in the supply room where no one else could see. She showed the woman what she'd done wrong, then how to fix it, then asked her gently, "Do you need help understanding this, or do you need more time with the numbers?" The temp nurse's eyes got wet. "Nobody's ever just asked me that before." Rachel nodded. She knew exactly what that felt like. Ambulance sirens wailed at 2247 that night. Incoming trauma, major MVA, 2 vehicles, unknown injuries, ETA for minutes. Rachel was in the trauma bay already. She lived in this place now, spent more hours here than anywhere else, because this was where she understood the world. This was where her training meant something. This was where she could walk toward the danger and nobody questioned why. The sirens got louder, then closer, then right outside. Her hand tremored for exactly half a second, the same way it had in Afghanistan when the alarm went up, the same way it would probably tremble for the rest of her life whenever metal screamed. She took one measured breath, and then the tremor was gone. She was steady. She was ready. She was who she'd always been. She walked toward the ambulance bay doors just as they burst open. Not running. Walking. The same purposeful stride she'd used in Kandahar, the same one that had carried her toward wounded soldiers with nothing but training and nerve and the absolute refusal to let anyone die if she could prevent it. "Talk to me," she said, and her voice was a command, quiet and complete. "What are we looking at?" The paramedics launched into their report, vital signs, injuries, response time, and Rachel's mind was already 3 steps ahead, already preparing the room, already deciding what protocol applied, already knowing exactly what came next. She didn't tremble. She didn't hesitate. She didn't hide. Because she wasn't hiding anymore. The combat boots on her office shelf stood tall in the fluorescent light, well-worn leather that had walked through deserts and through trauma bays and through the rain-soaked parking lot of a bus station where she'd almost given up. Those boots had carried her across the world and back again. They'd carried her through the darkest parts of herself and out the other side. They represented a woman who'd learned that walking toward the danger instead of away from it was the only direction she'd ever truly known, and she wasn't running anymore. She wasn't hiding behind a temporary badge and a borrowed name. She was Rachel Torres. She was a senior chief petty officer. She was the woman in the trauma bay, the one who didn't freeze, didn't flinch, didn't lock herself in an office while someone bled. She was exactly who she was supposed to be all along. If you've watched this story and found yourself thinking about the people in your life who might be carrying a different identity than the one everyone sees, please share this video. The men and women transitioning from military service to civilian life often carry invisible scars and unstoppable skills that most people will never recognize. Subscribe to this channel for more stories of hidden heroes, and leave a comment. Have you ever misjudged someone only to discover they were extraordinary all along?